welcome back to Never Enough Novels for a recap of all the books that I read in September. I didn't get through as many books as usual this month, but there were a lot of high star ratings, so I'm excited to share them with you. I'm going to put the links to all these books down below, so if you see any that catch your eye and you purchase them through Amazon, I earn a small commission at no extra cost to you. And make sure you hit like on this video and subscribe to my channel to see even more of my book recommendations in the future. These books are just in order from the ones that I finished first in the month up through the ones that I most recently finished. And first up is The Wasp Trap by Mark Edwards. This was a thriller. It's the first time I've read a book by this author, and I absolutely loved it. I gave this one 4.5 stars, which is pretty good for me for a thriller. It's set in dual timelines and focuses on these 6 co-workers who first met each other like a decade or two ago when they started working together on this project. They were trying to create an app that matches people for romance based on personality characteristics, but on the side, they started to develop this test that would help identify a psychopath. And all of the implications of that summer that they spent together are now catching up to them. So the other alternating timeline is in current day when the friends are reunited after not talking to each other for a very long time, and they are at a dinner party. But the dinner party goes wrong when they suddenly find themselves held hostage, and they are being forced to reveal a secret from that summer that they spent together, but they aren't exactly sure what it's supposed to be. However, apparently one of the 6 of them knows something that happened, and unless they reveal that secret, they're going to be slowly killed off one by one. I thought the author did a really good job with the pacing of this book, so the current day situation is really tense and fast paced, but we also get those flashbacks to what happened over the summer and like a slow reveal of all the different things that occurred during that summer. Sometimes those dual timelines can feel a little bit slow because you're being forced to jump back and forth when you don't necessarily want to, but this was really well done. It was a high stakes thriller with some intense situations, and I was flying through it to figure out what actually happened. Next up is a book that is absolutely perfect for this time of year. It is called The Honeycrisp Orchard Inn by Valerie Bowman, and I gave this one 4 stars. It's pretty typical small town romance, and it is packed full of fall-y activities, so it was just a really fun read this time of year. It's about a city girl who comes back to her hometown. She is an event planner, and she's helping the local apple orchard with kind of a last hurrah event to try and keep them afloat. But one of her former childhood friends is now running the orchard, and he's not exactly happy to see her because she hasn't really spent any time with her parents or back in the town, so he thinks she's not really committed to this project. But as Aiden and Ellie spend a lot of time planning this big fall festival together, he starts to realize that maybe she has changed and isn't exactly the person that he expected. It's got a little bit of spice and plenty of cute, adorable fall activities, so again, I just really enjoyed this one. It wasn't anything earth-shattering, but a really solid small town romance. One of the older books that I read this month was called The Other Side of Now by Paige Harbison, I think was the author's name. And this, I think, came out last year, and it had like a time travel, alternate timeline component, which I wasn't sure about, but I ultimately gave this book 5 stars. It is easily one of my favorite books of the year. It was way more emotional than I expected, and I was so fully invested in these characters' lives and their story that I couldn't put it down. So it's about a Hollywood actress who is starting to get sick of all of the fame and pressure that comes with the Hollywood lifestyle. So she decides to take a break and go on a trip to Ireland. But something happens while she's traveling, and when she wakes up the next morning in her little Airbnb, she realizes that all the townspeople know her and think she is someone different. So in this timeline, she never went to Hollywood and became an actress. She instead went to like a small acting school in the nearby town and stayed in town and developed relationships and friendships with the people there. And although this is extremely jarring and she has no idea what's happening, she realizes that this is the life that she has longed for so long when she just wants to get away from Hollywood. And she basically gets a chance to see how her life diverged and what might have happened if she made different choices. So there is a romance element of this, which I absolutely loved, but there's also a heavy friendship component because her best friend, who died in her original timeline when they were teenagers, is alive and well in this one, and she feels like she's seen a ghost because this girl that she grew up with and was best friends with, who she lost, is now a part of her life again. And that aspect is what brought some of the heavy emotions along. But ultimately, this book was so heartwarming and like a really interesting take on your choices in life and how you can change your circumstances even if you think you're locked into what they are currently. I highly, highly recommend it. Again, it's got a little bit of romance, a little bit of really solid female friendship, and just an overall really interesting story. Next up is a novella called Bad Date by Ellery Lloyd, and this is an author I've read a few times before. She kind of has an interesting take on different thrillers, and this was, I think, available from Amazon Prime for free, so I just picked it up on a whim and I flew through it in like an hour or two. It's about a woman who I think is a celebrity who goes on a few dates with this guy who has been stalking her, and it's kind of like a cat and mouse game between what he knows and what he's trying to do versus what she knows and what her and her friend are trying to accomplish. I really liked how she wove the story about the dangers of the internet and stalking and how that can turn into a really scary situation, but how these two women kind of turned that on its head and made their own choices and were able to ensnare this guy instead. I gave it 4 stars, so if you can find it for free on Amazon Prime, it was a really quick read and just kind of a fun thriller type novella. I finally read one of my older book of the month selections, which is rare but sometimes happens, and this one was called The Compound by Aisling Rowell. I thought this one was really interesting initially because it's kind of a reality show book, but it's a darker take on it. So our main character, Lily, wakes up in this compound and she is part of a reality show where there's a number of contestants, guys and girls, and they have to do different tasks and kind of work together as a team to get either luxury prizes or sometimes things that they need to actually survive. And these tasks are not always simple. Sometimes they're personal and sometimes they're cruel, but the group starts to get desperate when they run out of food or basic necessities. So it's a really interesting evaluation of reality TV and what people will do for fame or what lengths they will go to survive. I gave this one 4.5 stars. I thought it was really well written from start to finish, and the ending wrapped up in a really satisfying way. And it was kind of fun to see the author take these characters to the brink of something really dark and, maybe sometimes get there or sometimes just kind of go up to that line. So I've read plenty of reality show like romances and other types of books, but this as a thriller was a really fun setting. One of the audiobooks that I read this month was called Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, and this has been on my TBR for ages because The Martian by him is one of my all-time favorite books and one that I recommend to almost everyone. And I know some people love Project Hail Mary even more, so I was very intrigued about this one. It is about the situation Earth is facing where some sort of organism or thing has been eating away at our sunlight. So we are facing a horrific situation where Earth would lose sunlight, which sustains life on our planet. And as a result, this mission is sent to try and figure out what's going on and hopefully figure out how to stop it from happening. One of the things I love about Andy Weir is how he takes these incredibly complicated science and space concepts and writes them in a way that you can understand and also creates this compelling and action-packed story. So Project Hail Mary definitely has aspects of that, but overall I thought The Martian was a little bit more like a thriller and a little bit more fast-paced, whereas Project Hail Mary kind of focused more on the characters and their relationships and also developing the science behind it. So there were parts that I felt like went a little bit slower and where I wasn't as invested in the story. It just took a little bit longer to get through. Ultimately, I loved the book and I gave it 4 stars, but I just didn't like it quite as much as The Martian, just for me personally. But this book did have one of my all-time favorite characters in literature, and I don't want to spoil anything, so I will not give away who it is, but if you've read it or if you're interested in reading it, you probably know who I'm talking about, and I just absolutely loved every scene that he was in and could have used probably more of him throughout the book. Another thriller I read this month was called In a Dark, Dark Wood by Ruth Ware. This one I only gave 3.5 stars, and it feels like that's sort of a common trend with Ruth Ware's books. I always have really high hopes going in, and I feel like the stories sound intriguing, but ultimately it never feels like the payoff is quite enough for the amount of time I spend reading the book. This one is about a group of friends who are at kind of a remote house for a bachelorette party, and some things happen throughout the weekend and someone ends up murdered, and we're kind of unraveling like who the bad guy is. A lot of discussion about the relationships between all of the characters that are at the bachelorette party and their history, and then ultimately like what the motives were for this murder and kind of how it was all set up to happen this way. So it was fun trying to guess who actually did it and following different leads to get there. But ultimately, I prefer my thrillers to be extremely fast-paced and page-turning, and this just didn't have that aspect for me. And the last book I fit in this month was called Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. This is another one that has been on my TBR for ages. And I actually picked it up and realized I have this first edition, like sprayed edge version that I got at a book sale sometime a long time ago. But I'm pretty excited to have this special edition on my shelf now. I absolutely loved this one. I gave it 4.5 stars, and it was initially on my radar because I've heard of Leigh Bardugo before, and then recently I added this to my list of fantasy duologies, so I wanted to actually finally read it because I knew so many people had recommended it to me, and they were absolutely right. Again, I love that this is part of a duology, so I'm really excited to get into book 2, knowing that it's like a completed series of just 2 books. And there was enough of a cliffhanger at the end to keep me invested and still wanting to know what happens with these characters. The book follows 6 kind of unlikely individuals who are working together to pull off this major heist. So we've got a convict, a sharpshooter, a runaway, a spy, a heartrender, which is a magical person, and a thief. And they are tasked with this seemingly impossible heist to capture someone from a neighboring country's prison. The leader is Kaz, who convinces them to do it based on the enormous amount of money that they will receive if they pull it off. Each of the characters gets their own chapters in the book, and we see the story develop through all of their different perspectives. And throughout that time, we get to know their history and their relationships with each other, as well as just the plans for actually how they're going to pull this off. It's had a ton of elements that I absolutely love. It's like a pretty typical fantasy setting, a lot of different characters, including 2 female characters, which I thought were extremely well written. And just the overall cleverness of how they went about this heist is always so much fun to read and seeing what they come up with. So I highly recommend this one if you love fantasy books and you're looking for a completed series. So that wraps up my short and sweet book reviews of what I read in September. Let me know in the comments what your favorite book of the month is, or if you've read any of the ones that I did and what you thought of them. And stay tuned for more book reviews in the future.